All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully the rest will be able to join us shortly. We have Glenn here to talk to us about retweets and whether it's an endorsement or not. So, yeah, Glenn, take it away.
All right, yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks also to the organizers for organizing this great conference. I was really happy to see there's so many people who are working on, topics I'm also interested in. And yeah, so my talk today will be maybe discussing a slightly smaller issue than a lot of the other talks. So first, I will just say a few very basic things about social media testimony. And then I want to look at this question, what are retweets specifically? There are kind of two prominent views. One is the endorsement view, and the other is the quotation and extension view. And I kind of want to then kind of launch a defense of the endorsement view, which is not particularly popular in the literature. And I want to kind of offer a descriptive defense, so why retweets just are endorsements, at least in the most cases. But I also want to offer kind of a normative defense of why we should want to think of retweets as something like an endorsement. First of all, like starting out with social media testimony. So I think what's special about it is simply that social media kind of allows for novel speech acts, and these novel speech acts really kind of don't have clear norms yet. Their meaning is kind of up in the air simply because we didn't have a lot of time to kind of get accustomed to them and be clear what exactly they signify. And I'm thinking of two speech acts in particular, and that is the sharing and the liking of content on social media platforms. Regina Rini calls social media testimony bent testimony. And the reason for that is that normally in testimony cases, they involve someone searching something. But it is unclear if liking and sharing content is really an assertion. In some ways, maybe it is, but in others, it clearly isn't. And that's why, even if there are assertions, maybe it's only kind of a bent version of it, or bent testimony. Now, again, as I said, it's kind of not clear how we're meant to evaluate these new speech acts. And the two options that we have for kind of the sharing of content online is the quotation view. So that's simply, retweeting or reposting something or sharing something is just quoting it. And the other is the endorsement view, that if we retweet or share or repost something, we're actually also endorsing that content. I will focus here mainly on the act of sharing and reposting content. And the reason for that is that I kind of want to defend an endorsement view, which is under attack. Now, I think for the act of liking content, it is more clear why we would think of the act of liking something as an endorsement. It's not taken for granted that we would necessarily see it that way, but I can see there seems to be some kind of positive attitude expressed towards the liked content. But since I want to argue for the endorsement view also with sharing content, I will focus mainly on that. And I will also focus mainly on Twitter and the act of retweeting. Now, maybe that is a bit too specific. I do think what I'm saying, for the most part, the main takeaways remain the same for other social media platforms. There's one brief moment where we look at the interface of Twitter that is quite specific, but I think we can apply this to other media platforms, keeping in mind that they do have their own, specific differences that also allow for slightly different speech acts. And one of the reasons is also that retweets are kind of discussed in more detail in the literature. And also that I think Twitter is really kind of it makes sense that we think of Twitter when we think of the act of kind of reposting or sharing content. And the function of retweeting actually really lends itself to this particularly well. So I think Twitter is kind of a good example to take. So what are retweets? There's, as I said, no real consensus. And this is true both for kind of academia, for philosophic literature on it, but also for how we use it in everyday language. If you look at discussions outside, I mean, these sources are kind of like opinion, op-ed pieces and arguing kind of for one or the other, and there's no clear consensus. What we also see a lot on social media itself, particularly on Twitter, are disclaimers like retweet is not an endorsement. So this suggests kind of two things. It suggests that certain people are quite interested in the fact that when they retweet something, they're not endorsing this content. But it also suggests that there is kind of a default assumption maybe that we think of retweets as endorsements. Otherwise, you would not need a disclaimer. Here are a few examples. Try to find some examples from outside of the US, because after this, it will be very US-centric and also Trump-centric, and I really apologize for that. Yeah, so we have like here in the US, we have like an official city accounting for this, and also Jordan Peterson, who's a very controversial public figure who kind of uses this strategy to stave off criticism. But it's not really clear what we are to make of these disclaimers and if they're actually effective, and making us think that what they retweeted is not an endorsement. So what about in philosophical literature? I mentioned Rini already, talks about this, and Pep, Nicholson, and Sirkin. They kind of discuss this issue in the context of fake news. I think these are both papers that actually set out to define fake news and also speak about social media testimony. I think the latter, so Pep, Nicholson, and Sirkin, they're also working on something like specifically about retweeting, but as far as I know, this has not been published yet. Sarah Wright offers kind of a virtue epistemological discussion of reposting, which is not exactly what I'm going to do in the second part of my talk, but it is something I'm quite interested in. I'm quite sympathetic to kind of, trying to think about these issues in a kind of a normative sense in this way. And there's really just like one strong account of what the linguistic value of retweeting is, and that's by Neri Marsili, also kind of a newer paper. And I will talk about this one in more depth because it really has kind of the most in-depth analysis just of what's going on here linguistically. So Marsili kind of, says there are kind of two default views we can have, which I already mentioned, the endorsement view and the quotation view. And he then kind of puts forward his own favorite view, which is kind of related to the quotation view, but slightly different. It's the ostension view. Ostension here meant in the sense of pointing. Retweets are kind of a strange, digital act of pointing at content. So why does Marsili not like the endorsement view? For Marsili, he makes a claim that only assertions can be endorsed. However, we have empirical research that shows most retweets are not assertions, they're not even sentential, so they're not speech. A lot of retweets are just videos or GIFs or photos. And this kind of non-linguistic content, such as a cute cat video, in Marsili's sense, just cannot be endorsed. And so the fact that most retweets are not assertions means that even if we want to kind of take a normative approach and say, well, we should look at retweets as assertions, this will fall flat simply because this content is mostly not endorsable. Now, then he moves on to the quotation view, which he feels like holds more promise, so that retweets are just kind of quoting the said content, but they still differ from what a quotation normally would do. And he then says, well, retweets kind of have two different characteristics, right? They quote in the sense that they reproduce the source material, but they're also indicating, so they quote by indicating. And this indicating is kind of an act of pointing, so that's why he calls them ostensions. So retweets for him are something like pointing at a billboard, but with one really significant difference, because if you point at a billboard, you've kind of drawn attention to the billboard, but you've not kind of reproduced the billboard in any way. Whereas a tweet, yes, it kind of draws attention by pointing, but it also kind of reproduces the content in the sense that it's kind of then shows up again on your own Twitter feed, for instance, and it's attributed to you in a quoted sense. So I really like this paper, and I'm really happy that someone wrote about this issue, which I'm quite interested in. But I still kind of want to launch a defense of the endorsement view, which Morsilli is quite quick to dismiss as kind of a more naive view. So what I will say though before that is I do agree kind of on a descriptive level that not every retweet is necessarily meant to be an endorsement. I think retweets are quite complex speech acts, and the motivations underlying them can be manifold. However, I do want to kind of defend the view where an endorsement is kind of the default implicature, kind of according to Grice's use of this term, of retweets. So without other context, like just by default, if we know nothing else, we would assume that a retweet is an endorsement. And this is kind of a claim I want to defend descriptively. But then I also want to make a normative argument for the claim that retweets are endorsements, and that there are good reasons for this. So what are endorsements? I think a lot hinges on Morsilli's view of endorsement, which I believe is quite narrow, and in my opinion, too narrow, because assertions are most definitely not the only thing which can be endorsed. In fact, one of the most common uses of endorsing is endorsing people. Like if we endorse political candidates, for instance, that's one of the most common ways we use this, at least in everyday language. And I'm not sure why we should kind of discount these examples. So if people and objects can be endorsed, it's not clear why kind of non-assertoric content cannot also be endorsed. And that at least kind of takes away kind of this main argument why we should move away from the endorsement claim. Endorsement doesn't really have a fixed meaning in philosophy, at least not as far as I'm aware of. I'll look a little bit into the literature on that later. And Morsilli also doesn't provide one. He just kind of takes it for granted that only assertions can be endorsed. To kind of drive this home, so this is how Morsilli also thinks on this. This is the example he uses in his paper. So we have a tweet that Donald Trump retweeted, that Democrats are the only ones interfering in our elections. And then this is directly from Morsilli's paper. So he says, well, retweeting them in the endorsement would be something like uttering 4 or 5 in response to the statement. So I agree that they are, that Democrats are the only ones interfering, or true that. And then interestingly, he says something like, yeah, one agrees with or expresses approval of the assertion number 3. But I think rather than 4 or 5 here, what we're saying is not necessarily agreement, definitely not agreement in the sense of truth value necessarily, but we're rather saying something like, I approve of this tweet. And I think endorsement is more complex than simple agreement with a proposition, right? It's not necessarily tied to truth value. If I want to endorse something, I'm not necessarily, maybe I'm also trying to say that it's true, but I'm not necessarily trying to say it's true, right? If I can endorse a person, a political candidate, then obviously this is not something that is true or false. And I think it makes much more sense to think of endorsement as something to akin to, like public approval. And yeah, approval, I think in this sense really applies to more than just assertions. And if we think of retweets as public acts of approval, at least by default, then I think the endorsement view makes a lot of sense. In everyday language, so I looked at the Oxford English Dictionary to back me up here, and also the Oxford Learner's Dictionary. So we have this idea of confirmation, ratification, or approving testimony. I think nothing here restricts this only to assertions. And the second definition, where we have a public statement or action showing that you support somebody or something, especially the fact that it can also be an action, seems to also not restrict this in any way to assertions. Now, maybe there's just this is just the everyday use of it, and philosophy, we have a different understanding of endorsement. But I think this is not really true. I mean, I've really tried to find like kind of good accounts of it. I found one by Hus, who speaks of endorsement in the context of lying, and whether we can like endorse lies or what's going on there. It doesn't offer like directly a definition of endorsement, but he does distinguish between different kinds of endorsement, distributive, conjunctive, and for the most part endorsements. And so here we kind of have the difference of, we can endorse something wholesale or only like certain parts of it. I would definitely be willing to kind of admit that endorsements don't have to be kind of wholesale for endorsements of everything in the tweet. But that, they could be kind of like still, for the most part, endorsements or something even weaker than that. There's one more account by Fleischer where endorsing is kind of a doxastic state, which seems like also a very idiosyncratic view of it. I'm not really sure what to do with this view. I mean, I think this is not the way we would think of endorsement. Think about the question, is a retweet an endorsement? And I'm pretty sure this is not what Marsili means. At least he doesn't quote this paper. But yeah, I'm not sure, but I'm kind of leaving this out there. I think it's maybe also a bit strange to think of endorsing as a doxastic state. I also, something that I'm also kind of glossing over a little bit is that Marsili has other reasons why he rejects the endorsement view, which are the fact that retweets are easily cancelable or negotiable. There's a paper by Brooks, it's not even really forthcoming, but I think it is kind of in development that kind of answers these, and kind of the argument here is that if you're interested in producing kind of Austinian, in the Austinian sense, like sincere and felicitous speech acts, when we retweet, then they're not as easily cancelable or negotiable. And he also kind of points out that retweets seem to follow norms of retraction, which will be quite odd if they're not endorsements. And I just have to kind of gloss over this also with time, because I think I will already be a bit long. So, but I just wanted to point out that there's kind of more to this debate, and I focused on this question of how we view endorsement, simply because that's what, according to Marsili, is really in the way of saying, well, most retweets by default, the default implicature of a retweet is endorsement. And also maybe an argument against the normative sense. And these are maybe more fine-tuned arguments. So maybe why is the extension and quotation view not that good? I think when we think about retweets specifically, and here we are quite specifically on Twitter as well, the endorsement view is kind of more likely, just if you look at how it is set up. So the way Twitter functions, when we retweet something, we're not just highlighting the content, but we're also highlighting the fact that we ourselves have retweeted it. So if it is a pointing in the sense, we're not only pointing at the content, but we're really always pointing at ourselves as well, which I find quite odd and interesting. So we have an example here of, again, I'm sorry for another Trump example. I really hope this doesn't frustrate the Americans, especially in the audience, of such tweets that Donald Trump retweeted. And we see specifically Donald J. Trump has retweeted this. And we also see that in these tweets, the number of retweets is kind of quite prominently displayed and counted. So again, there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that I am the person, for instance, retweeting something. And there's a lot of attention to like the number of retweets, which I think goes a lot into what T was talking about in his talk, and the gamification of Twitter, where virality, achieving virality becomes a cumulative goal. Amassing retweets or likes becomes a communicative goal. And I think he's kind of right in his analysis, but if he is, that would also just suggest that as a default, retweeting content is seen as something beneficial and desirable, at least kind of in a general default state. And then another thing that's interesting is that the Twitter platform itself distinguishes between retweets, regular retweets, and retweet as a quote. And these quote tweets then allow retweeters to comment on the content they're retweeting and taking a stance toward it. And yeah, so I mean, that seems to suggest that regular retweets seem to function as endorsements, because if you want to kind of express a different attitude, there is this function on Twitter, right, with the retweet as quote, and there one can take a stance. And I think if one takes a clear stance there that is like negative towards this tweet, saying, look, I don't agree with this at all, then of course I would say it's not an endorsement at all. So in the last part of my talk, I just want to talk briefly about kind of the normative argument for thinking of retweets as endorsements, and I would propose the following norms. And this is again more general now about the sharing of liking of content on social media. So sharing and liking content on social media should be taken as endorsement unless the content is explicitly disavowed in the sharing process. So something like here in the quotes tweet, saying something negative would maybe be enough to make it not an endorsement, but regular retweeting is an endorsement. And blanket disclaimers in your profile, like retweet is not an endorsement, that's just not strong enough as a disavowal. And the burden of proof, or really the emphasis, the onus should really lie on the person sharing content, retweeting on social media. So when I say these should be norms, the question is, what kind of normativity is this? I think there are several options we could take. One is we could just say it's a constitutive norm of these speech acts, such as in a linguistic sense, which I would be very happy to do. You could also argue, with moral or prudential reasons, that this could help spread the spread of misinformation online. This could, clear up some confusion about the lack of norms regarding the speech act. I think these are all good reasons, and one could definitely argue that way. But because I'm an epistemologist by trade, I wanted to find kind of epistemic reasons to adopt these norms and endorsement view, and maybe also frameworks within epistemology that might be helpful. So preventing the spread of misinformation online, I think, is also an epistemic goal. So even though that could also be a moral reason to do it, I think purely epistemically, this is kind of good enough as a reason. But then if we think about the epistemic environment of social media, there are some really clear challenges, right? Like it's kind of a very novel environment, and it's led to kind of the ease with which misinformation can spread online. And so if we think about this, we have Shane Ryan's notion of epistemic environmentalism. And this kind of allows us to speak normatively about epistemic environments and how to better them. And I think this would be already a good framework that we could adopt to say, well, we need something like an endorsement view to better the epistemic environment of social media and make its norms more clear, protect the people using it from misinformation. Ryan says that an epistemic environment is constituted by facts, whether social or physical, that bear on epistemic attainment, gaining knowledge, understanding, and so on in that environment. And of course, social media is also an epistemic environment, but there are some things that are quite particular about it. First of all, it's just a massive space. We can reach almost everyone around the world online. It leads to a lot of anonymous interaction, which I think was commented on by a lot of talks before me. And what it also really leads to is just a deluge of information, so both information proper and misinformation. But it makes it really very hard for us as kind of consumers of social media to diligently parse through all of this information and kind of check what is right. And I think because social media is such a special epistemic environment, we have to think about communicative norms and maybe rethink them as to, in the sense of what they were before the internet age. Ryan wants to argue in his paper that, for instance, this honest testimony by experts should be kind of considered epistemic pollution. And I think we could do something similar with people who retweet misinformation. And this is just a framework that makes them more accountable. Another framework that might be useful is that by Caval, who argues that reliable testifiers should receive epistemic credit if their testimony leads to the sharing of knowledge or information of true beliefs. This can also be indirect if someone kind of doesn't directly testify but makes this testimony possible. And I completely agree with that, but I think we should also consider the flip side of this, that bad and unreliable testifiers should receive epistemic discredit if their testimony leads to false beliefs. And I think this is especially important if we think about the fact that online there's a lot of passive testimony. So testimony cases where the recipient is not really actively engaging with the source material, just kind of scrolling through social media, maybe not even like even inquiring into the question that it answers, but still forming beliefs based on this kind of passive exposure to information. And I think passive testimony leaves recipients very vulnerable. It limits successive control if you believe in such a thing. It challenges the notion, again, if we believe in such a thing, that we're entitled to trust testimony. And it makes us, in this sense, very vulnerable to the spread of misinformation, especially if we're flooded by a lot of information and we don't have kind of the means to carefully consider all these new bits of information that we're gathering. And so I think passive testimony really highlights the need to normatively evaluate the testifier rather than just the recipient of testimony. I want to give one brief example of how this would look. Again, I'm sorry for all the Trump stuff. So imagine Max is scrolling through Twitter, and several of the people he follows retweeted fake news which alleges that the 2020 US election was stolen. Max is not interested in politics at all. He just barely scrolls through. He sees the headlines. If he were to actually initially click on this link and look at the actual claims made in this fake news article, he would not believe it because it's very poorly written and badly argued for. But he just doesn't click on these links because they don't interest him. But after scrolling through this for a long time, he starts to form the belief that it's likely that voter fraud occurred in the 2020 US election. And I think here we can give direct epistemic discredit to those retweeting misinformation, especially if you have the endorsement view of retweets, right? This allows us really to hold them accountable and not say, well, I wasn't endorsing this. I was just, trying to take some other attitude towards it. We can also give indirect epistemic discredit to those who enable the spread of misinformation, such as large social media platforms. And I think this is especially poignant if we can argue that it's a very common phenomenon that there's misinformation out there, and these companies could be doing more to prevent it. I think in the case of Twitter and Facebook, this is arguably true. There is some empirical evidence of this that unfortunately I can't go into because of time constraints. And just to sum this up very briefly, descriptively, the endorsement of retweeting holds, at least in the sense of a default implicature. And then normatively, the endorsement view should also be adopted because it allows us to hold epistemic agents online accountable. And this is especially important given the epistemic environment of social media and the ease of which misinformation spreads in it. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I really look forward to the discussion.